Welcome back, Renaissance artists. This is Jessica Henry. Today we are going to do a plein air painting of this lighthouse. I want to demonstrate how to paint that really bright sunlight. So we're going to start out with just toning the canvas with a burnt sienna and ultramarine blue wash, very thin down, and I wipe it down. And here's my thumbnail sketch, and just showing you that I do keep it handy and ready. And when I do the thumbnail sketch, I'm working out the composition and the placement of my dark objects, light objects, and middle tone. And it's very important where you get those placements in your thumbnail sketch, because that's what you use as your blueprint for your entire laying in of the painting. So it's important to take your time and really focus on your thumbnail sketch. Even if it's more than, I usually say 1 to 2 minutes, but if you've got to do several of them, then you should do that. You don't need to get really detailed, but you do need to get somewhat accurate in the placement of the objects and their size relationship with the darks and lights. So that's your first very important rule. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the future. So I'm putting my lighthouse in the painting sort of off center. I want a little bit of a picket fence over there, and those are going to be my two lightest objects in the painting. Now I'm concentrating my efforts on the shape of this dark mass of tree foliage, because that's going to be a strong contrast to the lighthouse in its curvy, interesting shape, contrasting with the tall cylinder of the lighthouse. So I'm also laying in, kind of dividing the horizon where that shoreline is going to be and the distant hills and trees. This is Marblehead Lighthouse on Lake Erie, and we were up there painting. It was a beautiful, beautiful day. The problem with painting in the sunshine like this is that the sun moves, and so you'll see throughout this video it will cast a shadow on my painting every now and then. So even if you're out painting by yourself or whatever, you may have to pick up your entire easel and just move it to where you have a little bit more sun. So right now I'm just kind of figuring out that I didn't like where I had originally put that horizon, so I moved it up just a little bit. And now there were trees on that side. They were about as tall as the lighthouse, but I thought that they wouldn't look that interesting if I made them that tall, so I brought them down. Letting my lighthouse be the center of interest, and those dark masses of trees are just simply going to support the tall lighthouse shape. So I'm trying to make them as interesting a shape as possible. Of course, I'm not matching them exactly to the trees that I saw, but I'm using them for inspiration. Trying to be accurate to the feel and gesture of a tree. So it's not random, but it's also not an exact fastidious copy. So again, you can see I'm just putting little marks down. I quickly place in a general suggestion of where the lighthouse is going to go, and then I'll come back through and just sort of refine those general loose lines. Looking at the curves, we talked a little bit about perspective a few weeks ago, and we also talked about cylinders the first session of drawing. And so these curves, as we look at this tall cylinder, start to curve upwards, and at the curves towards the bottom, if it were to be a striped, horizontally striped lighthouse, they would do an interesting thing where at the top they would be more of an sideways C. We'd see them a lot more curved upwards. As they get down closer to our vision, they are horizontal. And so I'm just kind of cognizant of that as I'm painting the bottom of the lighthouse as well as the windows. So now I'm knowing that my focus is going to be on painting bright sunlight. I have to make sure to really at this point capture where those shadows are from the trees and how they kind of work their way a little bit up the lighthouse, and all these little interesting pieces of information that are really going to give that effect. So really just going over and making sure that everything is in place before I start adding color. And I want to suggest where the form of the lighthouse is going to go, because I know that when you're dealing with sunshine this strong, that it's going to change very rapidly in my scene. Even in about, I think I did this in about 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, and I edited out just every time I wiped my brush. So it's a little more than 30 minutes. and just placing in some of the windows. I want to have a general idea of where some of these details are going to go. I also thought that this would be interesting too, because we didn't have a plein air video that involved a structure. And so this might be very interesting. A lot of people do like painting lighthouses and also just regular houses, so I thought that I maybe would combine the two and just talk about painting a structure. And typically a white house is kind of one of those houses that people gravitate towards in landscapes. So here we go. Okay, so I'm deciding that that clump of trees is going to be my darkest dark. The other trees are going to be dark, but they're also going to be getting a lot of sunlight hitting them from the direction that the sun is coming in. So those I'm going to paint just a little bit lighter, since they are going to be getting more sunlight. So even as I lay down this thin coat, it's not thick paint. It's very thin. If I were to just walk away and just leave it alone, it would probably be pretty much dry to the touch in about an hour. It's very thin, and there's no oil at this point. It's just Gamsol or your odorless mineral spirits, and it's a very thin layer. You can, of course, use less and less Gamsol, and you'll make a darker color. It's like watercolor. The more of the thinner you add, of course, the lighter it gets. So that water I wanted just a little bit lighter than the trees in front of it, so I added more of the thinner. And here I'm fixing an edge. You can just rub a little bit of the thinner on, smudgy it out, and then just take a paper towel or a dry brush and wipe it out. Of course, that ends up being a lot lighter, and that's what I do with the paper towel. You can just wipe it out. You make a mistake, it's so easy, just wipe it out. Just like that. So now I'm referring to my thumbnail sketch. These are things that you don't get a chance to see in the video. That I'm just double checking, does it match what I had originally planned? If it doesn't match your thumbnail sketch and your plan, then you need to keep reworking it until it really fits that concept and idea. If your thumbnail sketch really does portray exactly what you want it to, then you are good to go. If your thumbnail sketch doesn't really convey, in this case, if it didn't convey that sunlit feel, then I needed to start over or try changing the angle of my canvas or whatever. But to get something to look sunlit, you have to have strong shadows and bright white lights. Sometimes it's very easy we think, to make something look sunlit, to just add a whole bunch of bright colors, and that doesn't always work. You have to have shadows to make those brights look even brighter. Well, now I'm starting on the sky. It was a beautiful, cloudless, sunny day, so just a nice ultramarine blue and a little bit of white. I did add more oil because this is a cotton canvas, and it's very difficult to paint on there, but I thought it might be easiest to demonstrate using a cotton canvas, since I know that many of you will be using cotton. So as you saw, I just dipped the corner of my brush in the linseed oil, and that just kind of smooths it out a little tiny bit so that it flows onto the cotton a little better. If you were to be using linen, it would come off the brush easier, but that's just cotton. Cotton is acrylic primed, and if it was oil primed, the oil paint would adhere to it better. And so, I'm just working my way down the painting with the violet dark blue at the top, and as it gets towards the horizon, we end up with a quite a bit lighter turquoisey color. As I'm working my way down the sky, I am adding just a little bit of white, and then I'll add just the smallest amount of phthalo green when we get towards the horizon. So I'm just trying to do a very nice, even, flat blue up there. So continuing my way down, I am again here starting to add a little bit more white and just the smallest drop of linseed oil, thinning that down a little bit and getting my brush fully loaded, and then just working my way down. You can see it's a little bit lighter than that violet that was at the top. Now this is that lighter passage with just the smallest touch of phthalo green and more white added to that. Just laying it down in nice solid pieces of paint, working around the objects. I'm not getting really fussy if some of that sky overlaps, because it's fine with, I can always just kind of paint over it. Now I'm taking my brush, I mostly have wiped the paint off my brush, and I'm going back up with just kind of cleaning it a little bit. So I'm coming in now with some of that far away distant hills, some yellow ochre to a violet color, so ultramarine blue and some alizarin. And that sort of gives me the illusion of sort of a green, far away forest, but it's not very green, just a touch of the red. Using that again for the shadow of the lighthouse. Just a nice darker taupe. And that is just a little bit of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, touch of yellow ochre, just to get that look of the trees back there. And as I'm working my way down, I'm going to go ahead and get in the water. And I'm starting that with a little bit more ultramarine blue, and then I add some yellow ochre into that. And I will be adding a little bit of white to it. Touch of oil. Just get a nice little pile of it there. A clean swipe. If you add a little bit more of the yellow ochre and white to the blue, it gives you sort of an earthy water color. Just like that. A little bit of white will lighten it as it gets closer to you. Just keeping that passage very simple, very light. The water back there was a little bit darker, but I wanted it to be softer and more muted because I really wanted the lighthouse and the strong, brilliant shadows and colors in the sun to be the star of the show and not the water in this painting. And so that I'm just working on adding the water all around the trees, and I'll get in between the trees. Just laying down. As you can see, whatever the direction calls for, that's the direction that I'm making the brush stroke. So in this case, I am just using horizontal brush strokes to create that feeling of it being a new plane. And so I'm just cleaning up some of these passages in here and refining the shapes and values a little bit more. Starting to figure out where I'm going to be thinking about edges and so forth. Wanting those cluster of trees to have a sharper edge than the ones further behind the big ones behind the lighthouse. And right now I'm thinking about the lighthouse. Of course, that's going to be the star of the show, so I want that to have a nice crisp edge, shadowed edge. Not really strong, I mean not paper cutout, but stronger than the other items because that has to be the star of the show. So I'm just mixing up a shadow color using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, a little bit of white, and painting that in place. I do end up lightening that because I feel that it was too heavy, and also because as my view changed and the light moved across the lighthouse, it did start to look lighter over there, and I kind of liked that effect better. So now I'm starting to focus on the strength of the shadows. And again, here I am going to be zeroing in on making this as bright and as brilliant as possible. So just looking at how those shadows kind of creep up the side of the lighthouse and also on the ground in front. These are important considerations to take in. Taking a little bit of yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and some white, I am making the kind of that reflected bounce light on the shadowed side of the lighthouse. And again, I'm using my brush to lay down pieces of paint in sort of a horizontal, slightly curved fashion, and it gives the illusion of the lighthouse being rounded. And so that's the passage that I'm working on in there. I take a little bit of that same blue that I had for the sky and paint it in the top part of the lighthouse where, of course, that light bulb would be sitting. It reminds me of when we were in Tuscany and we were in a town called Trequanda, and we painted the bell tower, and it was the same idea. We painted the sky inside the top of the bell tower there where the bell was. Same kind of idea. Very interesting effect. And so what I'm doing now, since I have that blue on my brush, is I'm going through and just really cleaning up the edges and making it look more refined. And so that's that part there. Alright, so I am working again on just really making sure that I'm satisfied with the clean edge of the shadow of that lighthouse, and then So I'm taking some of the sky color and just bringing it right up next to the edge, wiping my brush off and just kind of going in with a little bit darker color. Alizarin crimson, a little bit of ultramarine blue. I'm also taking a little bit of that alizarin and ultramarine blue and using it on top for the shadowed part of the red roof on the top of the lighthouse. Just making it a simple flat triangle, and over the top of that I'll take a little brush and just put in one piece of highlight to show the light hitting it. But there's really not a lot of detail you need to do. This lighthouse did have quite a bit of red on it as far as railings and different things like that. It really, it's a plein air study. It's not an architectural study. If I wanted to do that, I could take a picture and go back to my studio and really spend a lot of time getting the drawing and the railings and the people and everything, accurate up there. But for a plein air study, what you want to do is capture the accuracy of the moment rather than get in there with a ruler and a fine-tooth comb and try to straighten all that out. So you can, again, the idea is to capture the light and the color notes and some of that atmosphere. So I do want some of those in there, so I'm going through and just creating the illusion of there being a deck and a railing up there and a cast shadow, eliminating some of the red from that cast shadow so it looks more like it belongs to the side of the lighthouse. And I felt that I'd lost some of that impact up there in those transitional shadows. So I'm just taking a little bit of extra time and working on some of the finesse at the top of that lighthouse. Now I really want to hit it with that impact, so I'm taking some white and a teeny bit of the yellow and just making a really brilliant white. And that's how you can make something look sunlit. And here you can see that my canvas now is again in shadow, so I move it here pretty soon. As the sun moves across the sky, you're chasing that little spot of sun. But that's what you get for plein air painting. So I'm making a transitional shade in here, and it's very bluish in tone. I thought that I was getting into the sunlit part, but my palette was deceiving me. So that's a little bit more bluish. I saved that bright white with the teeny bit of cad yellow for the sunlit side. And so over here I'm just laying down sort of that middle tone, bright light. Not my brightest light, but it's getting brighter, of course, as the cylinder turns and starts facing the sun. Adding a few little spots of brilliance up there. Nothing very distracting, but again, this is about the lighthouse, so that's why I'm spending the most time on it, because whatever is your center of interest, that you want to give your most attention to. And so you can see I'm just kind of, what you don't see, because it's just impossible to get it all in the camera, is every now and then I am wiping my brush off, and sometimes I just take a mostly dry brush and sort of soften the edges as I'm working along so that it doesn't look too choppy. But I'm always paying attention to the direction that my brushes are going in so that it creates that feeling and illusion of a round cylinder. So taking that bright white, teeny bit of cad yellow, and a little touch of yellow ochre. So I'm working that till it gets to be that brightness that I see, and laying that down in a pretty clean swatch on that side of the building, just a nice simple area. And I'm working it around the shadows that are creeping up the side of the lighthouse as well. Back in the sunlight. Now I can see what I was doing. That's that bright light. And if you notice, I'm laying it over a white that was not quite as bright, because I was back in the shadow, in the shade of that tree, and it was hard to see if I was getting it bright enough, and I thought I was, but I wasn't, so I had to, when I moved it, I was able to make it even brighter. So little tricks you gotta learn. Chase that sunshine. And so what I don't want is, I don't want any of the other colors and areas to be distracting and compete for attention as I work on this. Alright, so now that I feel that the sunlight and a little bit of that impact there on the roof are brought in place, I'm going to go back through and just add some more of the detail spots, because I don't feel like I'm chasing that sun quite as much anymore, because everything's kind of laid in place. So I'm going to put in some of the little accent pieces on the lighthouse, those red shutters. That is a distinct shade right there in the sunshine, so I wanted that dark black window and then those red shutters really to just kind of pop. So that's a little bit of what I'm working on here. Just cleaning that up. Adding a little bit of detail right around everything. And so as part of the cleaning up process, I am just kind of cleaning up that window over there. It had this really great eave as it was sort of sticking out of the building, and I thought that was interesting. Now I'm going to work on some of these clusters of trees. I just made a darker area of color, just ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, a little bit of yellow ochre to give it that greenish hue. That's what I'm working on here. There's the yellow ochre. So I'm massing this in. My brush strokes are sort of this way and that way to suggest the feeling of shadows. If I were to paint them all one solid piece of flat dark and just really flat brush strokes, it wouldn't have that light, airy, whimsical feeling of leaves blowing even in the shadows. So that's why I alter my brush strokes as such. Just getting a little bit more of that, and a little less of the burnt sienna will make it a little bit greener. And that already is quite dark because of what I laid down to begin with. So I'm just kind of mostly just putting a greenish tint over the top of that dark shadow. By adding a little cad yellow to that blue, I'm giving it a nice, almost jade-like green, and laying that down as a middle tone. So I won't cover up all the dark down below, but as light moves down a tree, it's brightest at the top. So I start with that middle tone right at the top and I let it cascade down. And there it's mostly covering up the dark on those small trees because those ones are going to be getting a lot more of the sunlight. And so while I have the shadows right where I want them, I'm laying down those nice strong horizontal shadows as well as that sand at the base of the lighthouse. It's just a mixture of burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and some white. I wanted the lighthouse to feel like it was just kind of growing out of the sand, so I wanted that bright impact of the front of the lighthouse to match the brightness of the sand. And so that's what I'm working on there. And when you have shadows and it's a strong middle of the day sunlight, you have to make sure that your lights are maybe even a little bit brighter than what you see them, so that your shadows, if you paint the bright lights right near the dark shadows, it really will give you that strong sunlit effect. So I'm coming back through here in between these trees and just brightening up that water a little bit more so that the silhouettes of that shapes of that mass of trees stands out just a bit more. And so that's what I was working on there. Just cleaning up that passage because I thought that the trees were getting a little bit out of hand. So working on the green, the grass green, as it's coming towards us, I just wanted that really rich, grassy green in there. And laying that down in horizontal brush strokes to suggest the grass is on a plane that is flat now, and it recedes off in the distance. As it recedes, my brush strokes get less broad flat and more skinny flat. And since I have that color on my brush, I just put it up in other places where I see it. I'll do portraits very much the same way. If I have one color and I see it somewhere else, I'll put it where I see it. And I'm just kind of popping in places where I see the sun hitting its strongest, because I think that that's important. I wanted that up there, but not too much. I probably could have looked at that tree and seen a whole lot more sun, but I really did want it to be a strong supporting shadow piece. So just want that sunlit effect, and I'm going to leave the rest of that alone. So I'm going to clean up some of my edges there and some of my chunkier brush strokes and let that be the supporting actor. In this little cluster of trees, I just wanted, I'm kind of smoothing in that darker area to give it some interesting shape, and then I'll come back through later towards the end with some bright highlights. Keeping my shadows nice and horizontal. Just refining the shape of them because I don't want them to have too much of a zigzag feel. So I'm interspersing sunlight in between the shadow pieces just to make it kind of interesting in that area. So again, hitting up these highlights, and you'll see as I go through here, I'm just sort of cleaning up areas and edges, making it look a little bit more sort of one with the environment. Sometimes I'll take my brush and just completely wipe it off so there isn't any paint on there, and I'll just go up and see where I can soften an edge, or maybe a brush stroke was too chunky. I liked that picket fence. I wanted it to be supportive of the lighthouse. I thought it kind of echoed the same shape, only it was horizontal. So I made it a little bit darker than the lighthouse too, because I didn't want it to steal too much of the attention of the lighthouse. So it's just a little darker white, almost kind of bluish. It is, mostly vertical like that, so it's not going to be picking up the light the way that the lighthouse will, being at a slanted angle. Slanted is going to get more of the sunshine on it. Perfectly vertical will get more shadows because it's also picking up bounced light from the ground. And so these little trees and bushes are sort of hanging over that picket fence, and that's what I'm working on there. And then I just lay in a little bit of the dirt as it's coming through the grass. I go back through and clean up some of these edges, pop in a little light, and the painting's done. Thanks for joining me.